6:47 a.m., February 19th, 2026, Naval Air Station, Corpus Christi, Texas. 14 federal vehicles moved through Gate 3 in single file, headlights on in the grey morning fog. No sirens, no announcement. The convoy stopped at the far end of the Flightline Service Road, near a low concrete building marked Network and Infrastructure. Authorized personnel only. Inside, a man named D. Harlan Cruz was 40 minutes into his morning shift. Estimated replacement cost of the classified equipment he had destroyed 22 years earlier, $14 million. One civilian technician had died in that fire, and the man responsible had just been issued a federal access badge, cleared to work on the very network systems that replaced what he burned. The agents didn't move immediately. They held position while a plainclothes NCIS supervisor made one final confirmation call. The call lasted 38 seconds. Then the vehicles began moving again. Slow, deliberate. The way federal agents move when they know exactly where their target is and have no reason to rush. Dwayne Jerome Cruz, who had been living as D. Harlan Cruz, for the better part of 2 decades, was about to come face to face with a warrant that had been waiting for him since 2005. This is the story of how a man walked away from a federal arson investigation, rebuilt his identity one credential at a time, and then walked straight back into the same federal system that had been hunting him. And how a single fingerprint, buried in a procurement database, ended 22 years of quiet. The Naval Station Ingleside fire started at 2:11 a.m. on March 4th, 2003. Ingleside was a small installation on the north shore of Corpus Christi Bay, home to the Navy's Mine Warfare Command. Not a high-profile base. It didn't generate news. It processed classified mine countermeasure data, coordinated with fleet units, and ran a communications annex that handled encrypted traffic between surface warfare groups operating in the Gulf. That annex, a single-story structure designated CAOM 7, was what burned. The fire moved fast. Accelerant had been placed at 3 separate points along the interior wall, timed to ignite in sequence. The first burn point was near the server rack housing. The second was near the document storage cage. The third was near the main communications terminal. A civilian contractor named Roy Metcalf was inside when the fire reached the terminal. Metcalf was 44 years old. He had been doing overnight maintenance on the primary uplink system. He wasn't supposed to be there. His shift had been scheduled for the following night, but had been moved up at the last minute due to a scheduling conflict in the base's work order log. The arsonist, by all later evidence, had not known Metcalf would be present. The base fire response team arrived in 7 minutes. They pulled Metcalf out. He died at the hospital 4 hours later from smoke inhalation and 3rd-degree burns to his airway. The equipment loss was assessed at $14 million. The classified data loss was never formally quantified in any public document. NCIS opened the investigation that same morning. ATF joined within 48 hours at NCIS's request for fire origin and cause analysis. What they found, over the following weeks, was methodical and precise. The accelerant was a commercial-grade petroleum distillate, available at hardware stores, untraceable by purchase. The 3 ignition points were set by a timer mechanism constructed from components that could be sourced individually without triggering any flag. The person who set the fire knew the base's security camera rotation schedule. They knew the patrol timing for the overnight guard. They knew that Roy Metcalf was not scheduled to be in that building. They had access to internal scheduling data. That narrowed the suspect pool considerably. The investigation produced one primary suspect within 6 months, Petty Officer 3rd Class Dwayne Jerome Cruz, a junior enlisted sailor assigned to the Communications Division at Ingleside. Cruz was 23 years old. He had been at the installation for 14 months. He had access to the scheduling systems. He had worked a shift in COM 7-3 days before the fire. A partial palm print recovered from a non-burned section of wall near a secondary exit was consistent with his prints on file from his naval enlistment. The investigation also produced a motive, or the outline of one. Cruz had been passed over for promotion. He had received a formal counselling letter 2 months before the fire for improper access of a secure terminal, meaning he had logged into a classified system using another sailor's credentials. That incident had been logged, reviewed, and closed with administrative action, but it had effectively ended his chances of advancement in the Navy. A second incident of any kind would have resulted in discharge. Whether the fire was retaliation, an attempt to destroy evidence of something larger, or something else entirely, investigators were never entirely certain. The counselling letter was the most visible thread. They pulled it. But Cruz himself was not available to question. He had failed to appear for a routine personnel muster on March 19th, 2003, 15 days after the fire. He never appeared again. The initial search was limited and largely internal. Base security confirmed Cruz had departed the installation grounds on March 17th on approved liberty. He had not returned. His barracks room was empty. His personal vehicle, a 2001 Ford pickup registered in his name in Bexar County, was found 11 days later in a long-term parking structure at San Antonio International Airport. The keys were in the wheel well. The vehicle had been wiped. No flight record for Dwayne Jerome Cruz appeared in any airline database for that date or the following 2 weeks. He had not used his military ID for any transaction. His bank account, a credit union account tied to his military pay, showed a cash withdrawal of $2,200 on March 16th, the day before he left base. After that, nothing. NCIS placed a federal lookout on his name and service number. A material witness warrant was issued. In early 2004, a criminal arrest warrant followed, signed by a federal magistrate in the Southern District of Texas, charging Cruz with 1 count of arson of federal property, 1 count of destruction of government property, and 1 count of involuntary manslaughter in connection with the death of Roy Metcalf. The warrant was active. But Dwayne Jerome Cruz had, for all investigative purposes, ceased to exist. The investigation continued for 2 more years. NCIS ran down every lead. They contacted family members, a mother in San Antonio, 2 siblings in Houston. The mother said she had not heard from her son since Christmas 2002. She was cooperative but had nothing. The siblings said the same. Investigators believed them. There was no indication that Cruz had maintained contact with anyone from his prior life. The case was reviewed twice for possible links to larger schemes: the theft of classified data, the sale of information to a foreign entity. Neither review produced evidence. The fire appeared to be individual action, personal grievance, catastrophic in consequence but narrow in scope. In 2006, Naval Station Ingleside was closed as part of the base realignment and closure process. The Mine Warfare Command was redesignated and relocated. Physical records of the Ingleside investigation were transferred to an NCIS regional archive in Norfolk, Virginia. The digital case file was maintained in NCIS's investigative management system, but it was not actively linked to contractor vetting databases, federal employment screening systems, or the background check infrastructure managed by the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency. It was an administrative gap. Not unusual for a 2006 transfer. Databases weren't as integrated then. The architecture that would have caught the link simply didn't exist yet. The warrant never expired. Federal arrest warrants don't expire. But without active pursuit, without a live suspect thread, without a tip or a sighting or a database hit, the case went cold in every practical sense. The file was closed. The warrant was not. What Dwayne Jerome Cruz did between March 2003 and December 2025 is now documented, partially, in court filings, background check records, and a sealed NCIS timeline submitted to the Federal District Court in Corpus Christi. He did not leave the country. He stayed in Texas. He moved to the Dallas-Fort Worth area, where he had no family connections and no prior associations that investigators were aware of. He began working under the name D. Harlan Cruz. Not a fabricated identity in the traditional sense. He used his actual surname. He used his middle name, Harlan, which did not appear on his Navy enlistment records, as his first name. He obtained a Texas state ID in that name through a process that NCIS later described only as exploiting procedural gaps in the state's documentation requirements at that time. The name variation was small enough to pass through most automated checks, large enough to break the exact match logic that dominated federal database searches in 2003 and 2004. He started working as an electrician's helper. Within 3 years, he had accumulated enough documented experience hours to sit for the Texas Journeyman Electrician exam. He passed. He got his license. The license application required a background check. That background check, conducted through a third-party screening service, queried criminal records by name and social security number. D. Harlan Cruz returned no criminal record. Dwayne Jerome Cruz's federal warrant was not accessible through the lookup pathway that screening service used. He worked as a licensed electrician for 7 years. He built a reputation. He was good at the work. He did commercial and industrial jobs. He did federal building maintenance work, GSA contracts, Army Reserve facility maintenance, a courthouse HVAC retrofit. Each of those jobs required some level of background check. Each cleared him. I went through the available court record on this, and one detail kept pulling at me: the number of times this man passed a federal screening. Not once, not twice. The court filing lists 9 separate background checks conducted on D. Harlan Cruz between 2006 and 2024. 9 separate opportunities for the system to catch what it missed. 9 clearances. The transition from licensed electrician to defense IT subcontractor happened around 2014. Cruz had been doing electrical work on communications infrastructure, server rooms, network closets, cabling systems. The work overlapped naturally with IT infrastructure. He took online courses. He obtained CompTIA certifications. He added network technician work to his portfolio. By 2016, he was working primarily as an IT subcontractor, specializing in structured cabling and network infrastructure installation for commercial and light industrial clients. The step into defense contracting came in 2018. A small firm he worked with regularly won a subcontract for communications infrastructure maintenance at a National Guard facility in North Texas. Cruz was brought in as a technician. That job required a NASI, National Agency Check with Inquiries, the lowest tier of federal background investigation. The NASI cleared him. What's most surprising about this case isn't that Cruz evaded detection for 22 years. It's that the system that cleared him 9 times was operating exactly as designed. The checks were not failures in execution. They were failures of architecture. The wall between military criminal records maintained by NCIS and the contractor vetting infrastructure managed by DCSA. That wall existed because those systems were built separately, funded separately, and integrated only partially, only recently, and only for active cases with specific flags. Dwayne Cruz's case had no active flag. It was cold, archived, sitting in a regional file in Norfolk. The break came not from any investigative initiative. It came from an algorithm. In October 2025, the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency implemented an updated deconfliction protocol as part of a broader modernization of the National Industrial Security Program. The protocol required that all secret-level facility clearance applications, not just the highest-tier clearances, but all secret-level requests, be cross-referenced against a wider set of legacy NCIS investigative records dating back to 2000. It was a technical change, a data integration update. The kind of thing that gets 1 paragraph in a DCSA quarterly report and no coverage anywhere else. In December 2025, a defense firm called Meridian Network Solutions submitted a secret-level facility clearance application for D. Harlan Cruz, in connection with a contract to modernize the network infrastructure at Naval Air Station Corpus Christi. The application went into the DCSA processing queue. The updated deconfliction protocol ran automatically. It queried the expanded NCIS archive. The query returned a partial match, not a name match. The name variation, Dwayne Jerome versus D. Harlan, was still enough to avoid a direct name hit. The match was biometric. Cruz's fingerprints were on file from his Navy enlistment. His fingerprints had also been submitted as part of a federal employment background check in 2021, when he had done work on a GSA-managed building that required biometric enrollment. That 2021 fingerprint submission was in a federal employment database. The deconfliction protocol, for the first time, queried that database against NCIS's archived partial print from the 2003 Ingleside fire scene, the partial palm print from the COM7 wall. The match was flagged as a probable, not a confirmation. The partial print from 2003 was degraded, and the comparison produced a statistical probability, not a certainty. DCSA passed the flag to NCIS's current investigative office. An NCIS supervisory special agent in San Antonio pulled the original Ingleside case file. He read the case summary. He read the arson findings. He read the suspect summary for Dwayne Jerome Cruz. Then he read the clearance application for D. Harlan Cruz. He sat with that for a while. Then he called the FBI's San Antonio field office. The coordination between NCIS and FBI moved quickly once the probable match was confirmed through a secondary fingerprint comparison. A senior fingerprint examiner at the FBI laboratory in Quantico reviewed both sets of prints, the 2003 partial and the 2021 federal employment submission. The examiner's conclusion: 7 points of comparison consistent between the 2 sets. The partial was insufficient for a court-ready identification under current standards, but it was sufficient for probable cause purposes. The 2003 arrest warrant was still active. That was the foundation. A new federal complaint was drafted, adding updated charges and incorporating the fingerprint evidence. There was a tactical problem, though, and it nearly derailed the arrest before it happened. The facility clearance application for D. Harlan Cruz had been submitted. It was being processed. If DCSA issued a denial, the expected outcome once investigators flagged the match, and that denial was communicated to Meridian Network Solutions in the standard way, Cruz would likely be informed. And he had already proven, in 2003, that he knew how to disappear. The decision was made to let the clearance application proceed to provisional approval while the arrest was being coordinated. That decision was documented in the case file and reviewed by the U.S. Attorney's Office before implementation. It was not made lightly. What it meant, in practice, was that Dwayne Cruz received a provisional secret-level clearance badge on February 5th, 2026. He reported to work at NAS Corpus Christi with that badge on February 9th. His arrest warrant was served on February 19th. The 14 days between those two events were deliberate. Investigators needed to confirm his daily pattern, establish his precise location within the installation, and coordinate the arrest in a way that controlled the environment. An active federal installation, with flight operations, armed security, and restricted areas, is not an easy arrest location. The operation required coordination with base security, with the installation commanding officer, and with the contractor firm that employed Cruz, which was kept in the dark about the reason for the coordination until the morning of the arrest. Think about what the lead NCIS supervisor was managing here. You are coordinating the arrest of a man who burned a federal building and disappeared for 22 years. He is now inside a federal installation, working on classified network infrastructure, with a clearance you provisionally approved specifically to get him there. And you have to hold that for 14 days without letting anything leak. One wrong call, one email to the wrong person, one administrative notice generated by the clearance system. Any of those things could have sent Dwayne Cruz out a gate and into a new identity. The containment held. There was one complication in the final days. On February 16th, 3 days before the scheduled arrest, the NCIS supervisor received a notification from DCSA that the provisional clearance system had generated an automated review flag on Cruz's file, a routine 30-day check that was standard protocol for all new secret-level clearances. The flag would have generated an administrative notice potentially visible to the contractor firm's security officer. The supervisor had 40 minutes to get DCSA to suppress the notice through an active investigation hold. He made 4 calls in that 40-minute window. The hold was granted with 11 minutes to spare. On the morning of February 19th, 14 federal vehicles staged at Gate 3. The convoy included NCIS agents, FBI agents from the San Antonio field office, and Corpus Christi base security personnel. 2 agents were already inside the network infrastructure building, having entered earlier on a fabricated maintenance call. D. Harlan Cruz arrived at 6:31 a.m. and badged in at the door. At 6:47 a.m., the convoy moved. The agents inside the building identified themselves at 6:49 a.m. Cruz was seated at a workstation running a cable installation test. He did not resist. He did not attempt to flee. He stood up, placed his hands on the workstation surface without being told, and said, according to the arrest report, nothing. He was placed in handcuffs and walked out of the building at 6:53 a.m. The entire entry and arrest took 4 minutes. 22 years, 9 months, and 15 days after Dwayne Jerome Cruz disappeared from Naval Station Ingleside, he was back in federal custody. Here's the take that will probably generate some debate. The real failure in this case is not that Dwayne Cruz evaded detection. Individuals evade detection. That happens. The failure is that Roy Metcalf's family spent 22 years without resolution because 2 federal agencies, NCIS and the predecessor to DCSA, maintained separate databases that were never integrated. That is an institutional decision with a body count attached to it. The gap was known. Integration had been discussed. It was deprioritized for over a decade. Cruz didn't outsmart the system. He walked through a door the system left open. We'll say plainly what most won't. That's not just a procedural oversight. That's a policy failure with a name on a headstone attached to it. Roy Metcalf, age 44, civilian contractor. Died in a fire he wasn't supposed to be in, on a shift that was changed at the last minute, in a building that was targeted by someone who knew the schedule. His family was notified of the arrest within hours of it occurring. An NCIS victim liaison officer made the call. The initial court appearance for Dwayne Jerome Cruz, identified in court documents under both names, took place on February 21st, 2026, before a federal magistrate in the Southern District of Texas. The charges: arson of federal property, destruction of government property resulting in death, and involuntary manslaughter. The U.S. Attorney's Office indicated in the initial filing that they were reviewing the case for possible additional charges, including obstruction, based on Cruz's use of a name variation to obtain federal employment while a warrant was active. Bail was denied. The court found that Cruz had demonstrated, through 22 years of conduct, that he was a flight risk. That finding required no elaboration. The legal proceedings moved through the pre-trial phase over the spring of 2026. The fingerprint evidence was challenged by the defense in a Dobbs hearing in April. The court ruled the comparison admissible under the probable cause standard applied at arrest and allowed the government's fingerprint examiner to testify. The partial print from 2003, the defense argued, was insufficient for identification. The government countered that it was not the sole basis for the case. It was the trigger for an investigation that produced additional evidence, including records linking Cruz's name variation to a pattern of deliberate evasion. What those records showed, in aggregate, Cruz had used the D. Harlan Cruz name exclusively since at least 2005. There was no evidence he had ever used his legal name, Dwayne Jerome, after leaving San Antonio Airport in March 2003. Court filings from the pretrial phase describe a Texas state ID application that was, in the court's words, consistent with deliberate use of a name variant to circumvent federal record checks. That language was added to the indictment. The additional obstruction charge was formally filed in May 2026. One detail that stayed with me, reading through the pretrial filings. In 2021, Cruz submitted fingerprints as part of a federal employment background check for a GSA building access application. He submitted his actual fingerprints, his real prints. The same prints that would, 4 years later, match the partial from the Ingleside wall. Either he didn't know the 2003 partial existed in the NCIS archive, which is possible, or he calculated that the databases would never be connected, which is also plausible, given that they hadn't been for 18 years. What he didn't account for was a data integration update implemented in October 2025 by an agency that didn't exist in its current form when he disappeared. That's the part that doesn't sit easily. Not the crime, not the arrest, but how close it came to being a miss. If the DCSA modernisation had been delayed by one contracting cycle, if the deconfliction update had rolled out in early 2026 instead of October 2025, Cruz would have completed his work at NAS Corpus Christi, collected his contract payment, and moved on. The clearance would have expired. The database query would have come in too late, or not at all. 22 years. And the margin at the end was a procurement schedule. What do you think? Did the system fail Roy Metcalf's family? Or was this outcome, 22 years late as it is, what accountability actually looks like in federal cold cases? Drop your answer in the comments. We read all of them. The sentencing phase for Dwayne Jerome Cruz has not yet occurred as of July 2026. Pre-trial motions are ongoing. The government has indicated it will seek the maximum available sentence on each count, citing the death of Roy Metcalf, the duration of Cruz's evasion, and what the U.S. attorney described in a press statement as deliberate, sustained exploitation of federal systems designed to ensure public trust in defense contracting. The maximum on arson of federal property resulting in death is 20 years. The obstruction count carries an additional 5. If the sentencing court runs the counts consecutively, Cruz is looking at a term that, at 45 years old, amounts to the rest of his functional life. But the sentencing is not the only open question. The NCIS case file for the 2003 Ingleside arson contained one unresolved thread that investigators never closed. The fire was set by someone who knew the security camera rotation schedule at the installation. That schedule was not publicly available. It was not in any document Cruz would have had routine access to as a junior enlisted communications sailor. His job gave him access to the comms annex floor plan and the scheduling system. It did not give him access to the base security patrol rotation. Someone gave him that information. Or he obtained it in a way that has not been established. That question, how Cruz knew the patrol schedule, was raised in the original 2005 investigation and never answered. It is raised again in the 2026 pre-trial filings in a footnote from the defense challenging the sufficiency of the government's motive evidence. The government's response does not address the scheduling question directly. It does not need to, for the purpose of this prosecution. But the question sits there. There may be a second person in this story who has not yet been identified. The DCSA, for its part, issued a brief public statement in March 2026 confirming that the procedural gap identified in the Ingleside case, the lack of integration between legacy NCIS investigative records and contractor vetting systems, had been corrected as part of the October 2025 modernisation. The statement noted that the update now applies to all secret level and above clearance applications and includes a retroactive cross-reference sweep of archived cases going back to 1995. How many other cases that Sweep has flagged has not been publicly disclosed. Naval Station Ingleside no longer exists as an installation. The land is partly occupied by a city park and partly by a private development. The building that was COM 7 was demolished in 2008 as part of the Brat closure site remediation. Nothing marks it. Roy Metcalf's name appears in an NCIS victim memorial database maintained internally. It does not appear in any public memorial. If you've been following this channel, you know we cover cold cases precisely because of stories like this, where the resolution isn't clean, where the numbers don't add up neatly, where the system that caught the suspect is the same system that missed him for 2 decades. Comment warrants below if you want us to go deeper on the federal contractor vetting system, how it works, whether gaps still exist, and what cases like this one are forcing it to change. Subscribe so you don't miss that one when it drops. The Ingleside fire closed the COMOM 7 Annex in 4 hours. It took 22 years to close the file. Roy Metcalf's family spent that time in a waiting room that the federal government forgot to check. The warrant was served. The database gap was patched. What caused the gap in the first place? And how many Dwayne cruisers passed through it before October 2025? That file is still open.